Good morning from Wisconsin, everyone. Welcome to my computer. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join me. There are rather more people than I expected here, so that is both intimidating and exciting. So thanks for taking the time. This is my first live stream. It's something that I've been thinking about doing for a little while. I've talked to some of you about this and I've tweeted about it. And so before we start, I wanted to kind of give a little preamble about some of my thoughts about doing something like this. One reason that I've been interested in live streaming is that I really like about the cartographic community the fact that it's so invested in sharing knowledge. All of my colleagues are so very non-proprietary. They come up with something cool or interesting, they want to share it with each other at conferences and videos and blogs, etc. And I really love participating in that. And videos are one way that I could do that. And I've made some videos before, but I'm extremely detail obsessive. And so I knew that if I made a pre-recorded video, it would take me many, many hours of careful editing and multiple takes and scripting, etc. Whereas if I just do this live, off the cuff, I'm kind of making sure I just get it done. So it's kind of a lower impact way, even if it does potentially lend to a less perfect final product, which does make me slightly uncomfortable. Again, very detail oriented. And the other thing that really kind of draws me to the idea of this platform is the fact that there's a chance to sort of build a little miniature community during these moments. I interact with a number of you on Twitter, and I see people in person. And it's nice to be able to have these kind of interactions and engagements in our own sort of little virtual world here on the internet, here on my computer in Wisconsin. So, and your computer wherever you are. So I want to kind of see how this goes. And what I really would like to see as well is some engagement during this process from all of you. I'm doing this live partly because I'd like you, during the time that we're together, to ask some questions of me and to make comments or talk with each other. So if you can make sure to check in on the chat window there, and I've got it open on my phone next to me so I can see that, for example, they're having a watch party in Oregon. Thank you, Alethea, for joining us, and you and your colleagues there. And I should mention, too, that due to the latency, I'm like 10 seconds ahead of all of you. So if you do say something or ask a question, there might be some time delay. Depending also on what I'm doing, I might not get to it for a few minutes, but I am here, I am paying attention. So yeah, thanks for joining me. So what I'd like to do today is a breakdown of a map that I've already made. This is the sort of thing that I appreciate watching others do. And I go to the NACIS conference every year, which is my professional society that has an annual meeting all around the United States and Canada every year. One of the things that people like to present is they talk about something that they did in the last several months. And they will break that project down and talk about some of the challenges, some of the decisions that they made, and I really get a lot out of doing that. So that's kind of what I want to do today. So what we're going to actually look at here, if I sort of dig into my portfolio. By the way, let me go back. This is my website. Now, if you want to visit it, somethingaboutmaps.com. It's where I keep links to tutorials and other various interesting things and how you can get in touch with me and contact me. But if I go to the portfolio here, this is a map that I recently made of China. For a client in London. Frank Langfit is his name, and I checked with him, and he gave me permission to make use of this map in my live stream. And he is writing a book that's I don't think it's out quite yet, but it should be soon. He's writing a book about some people that he met during his time as a correspondent in China, and kind of various bits about their background, and it's about a free taxi service that he helped create in Shanghai, and some of the people he met through that. So there's some cool background to this. So this is the map we're going to be looking at, and I'm just going to pull that up in Illustrator here, and I've got my screen appropriately sized for streaming. I'm not used to things being quite this small. I usually work from a 5K Retina monitor. And I've downsampled this to like 1600 by 900 pixels just to make sure things kind of look good on various screen sizes for all of you, and hopefully all of this will be successfully recorded by YouTube so that people can watch it later. And I want to make sure all these sort of bits of interface look good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this map, all the various layers, off. And we'll just kind of go through it from the ground up. And the first thing I've got here in my layer tree, and I like to get very deeply nested in my layer trees. You can see I've got a layer inside another layer. So I've got sort of this three-level hierarchy going on here. I firmly believe in very strong hierarchical levels of organization in my Illustrator projects, because I would otherwise probably be prone to getting very lost about where did I put that layer, where did I put that color, etc. So the first layer I've got here, first sublayer I've got, are my various fills for the countries. And if you look at China here, I've just put it in its own separate layer, given it a little bit of a dark color to pop it out from everything else, but it's still not super dark. If I look at this thing, it's 40% gray. That's, if you saw my talk that I gave at NASIS in October, I talked about sort of thinking about making monochrome maps, which is something I love to do, and one of the reasons I chose one for this purpose. Think about monochrome maps as being made of a sort of a bandwidth. You have all the grayscale range from 0 to 100% black. And you want to try and be careful about how you use that and think about it as a limited resource. And so I want to make sure that if I'm going to drop all this other stuff on top of the map, some various towns and text about where various people in the book came from and where they went to, I want to make sure that my background is light enough to not compete with those kind of things. I want to maintain a strong visual hierarchy. So I've got China popping out some, but it's not super dark. Now, if you look at this, the shapes of the land, they look a little blobby. And especially if I look down here in the Philippines or in South Korea, look at those islands. They just kind of look like little circles and dots. And the reason for that is, talking to the client, one of the things that had inspired him in some previous maps that he had seen were some hand-drawn looking maps, some things that look kind of stylized like you might find a sketch. This is a book about people and their stories, and he wanted kind of an informal look to it. And it's more apparent too if I switch over to outline mode. I'm going to hit Command Y here, and I just look at the sort of the bare vector paths, and you can see they're all kind of loose. This is a hand-drawn set of line work, and I got this through Project Linework, which is something that many of you have probably heard me talk about a lot. This is an online library that I curate of various kinds of stylized cartographic line work. And there's all kinds of interesting approaches to it. So this one up here, 1981, is very angular looking. One of the ones that I like to use a lot, though, is this one here, Moriarty Hand. And this is by my colleague Dylan Moriarty. And one day I asked him to take the time to simply draw out all the countries of the world, as well as some rivers and states and various other things at 2 different scales. And this is all available for free download. It comes in shapefile format, and it covers, there's details coverage here, covers the coastline, countries, various states and provinces, major lakes, major rivers. You can get shapefile format, GeoJSON, and Illustrator files, as well as SVGs. So it's kind of everything you need to go with getting a hand-drawn look in your map without having to actually hand draw it yourself. So it's really flexible and powerful. And so I just dropped this in and I was ready to go and had a hand-drawn look already. Once I've got that as my base, on top of that, I've got some various highlighted provinces. There are 5 of them, I believe. 5 or 6 of them that specifically were important to the story. There's specific places that the author wanted to mention. And in this case, I did not have Moriarty hand line work for these kind of things. So I took more accurate vectors from Natural Earth, I want to say, and simply redrew them, kind of just did a little hand sketching myself. One thing you'll notice is that here this does align to the this particular shape here aligns to the coastline of Moriarty Hand. I needed to make sure that I matched those two things up. And I'm also noticing, there's a huge number of vector points here, which is, I probably could have simplified that. I think my final size is a little smaller. The original vectors were maybe a little too over accurate given the loose nature of the line work. So one thing that I find really handy is if I want to try and get two things to line up together, there's a really powerful tool that I make a lot of use of in Illustrator called Shape Builder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw another province right here, and I'm going to make it line up with my coastline. So just for a second, I'm going to make myself a new layer to mess around in. And to make this stand out, I'm going to kind of draw a red line here. I'm going to say, let's say my province looked mostly like this. And then I'm just going to draw these overruns that go past the coastline. And what I can do, if I unselect that for a moment, I'm going to take China here, my China shape, and I'm going to copy it into my new layer. And I'm just going to go over to the selection here, the green dot, and I'm going to hold Alt and click and drag, which makes a copy as I drag. And I let go. So now I've got an extra China here in my layer 22. I've got two things. I've got China and I got my line. I put my line on top. And if I select these two things, and I go over to the Shape Builder tool, which is this thing right over here, Shift-M. I'm very big into memorizing shortcuts, and I hit Shift-M a lot. As I mouse over, various things highlight. And what it's telling me is it can start to make shapes out of these things. So if I click here once, and you might have noticed over in the Layers panel, things changed. Now, instead of two objects, I've got four. I've got this little dangling end, which I can delete, another dangling end, which I can delete, and then I have this shape. This is now sorry, I'm still in the Shape Builder tool there. Let me go back to the black arrow here. I've got China as separate now from this thing. So let me undo, move those back in place, and lock this out here. So I can get rid of my extra China, and now what I've got left is this shape. And I can, switch fill and stroke so you can kind of see what it's made of. It's really valuable for redrawing things. It's especially oftentimes I find myself tracing. You might need data from an old map, for example. Might have to dig through. You go to Wikipedia, find something from a 19th century atlas, and it's I need to draw some various lines for a boundary, and maybe it turns out this country intersects this river over here. So if I have those two things, I can use Shape Builder to just draw an overrun of this country line. And if this was, let's say, blue for a second, I can make sure that country just stops at the river and just say, let's hold Alt while using the Shape Builder and cut that off. So you can get things to real nice and clean. I kind of wish there was something like this in ArcMap. If you actually want to work with shape files and geodatabases and clean things up quickly, visually, interactively like that, that'd be kind of cool. So that's how I got some of these various shapes that I quickly, roughly hand drew, and then I made sure they lined up with each other by using Shape Builder. Real powerful. And I see that Rosemary is saying that she has recently been shown that by her colleague Claire, and it is definitely, I agree with you, very powerful. Use it all the time. And it is probably, I don't know, it's got to be, other than the really basic drawing and coloring tools, Shape Builder is probably one of the tools that I turn to most often. Yeah, it is, and it is definitely better than Pathfinder for a lot of things. It's still, you might want to use the Pathfinder tools if you've got a bunch of different things to intersect with each other all at once. Because if I wanted to intersect these three things and make sure that this one, give these all strokes, so I can see and find the intersection of those three, then if I do Pathfinder, I'm not coming up with a good example on the fly, but I definitely still use Pathfinder sometimes. But Shape Builder is a little bit more interactive. All right, so I've got my provinces that I've specifically highlighted. On top of those, I've got some boundaries between them. And as I revisit this map, I kind of wish I'd done this a little differently. I've got these boundaries so you can tell the difference between them because I wanted to give them the same fill color, but I kind of think that I went too dark here. This is 80% black, and that's pretty high on the visual hierarchy. What I might have done instead is given it the same color as the China fill, which, let me check over here, that's 40%. So let me go back. I'm just going to lock these layers. I try and lock things that I'm not working with. I don't always remember to do that, but it does prevent me from accidentally moving things around and clicking them. So I tell my students, like, lock every single layer you're not working with. So let's go back and make this 40 for a second. Let's see how that looks. I think that's kind of better. All right, I'd need to kind of drag some of these out to make sure they overrun enough to cut cleanly through. But yeah, probably could have done that. Maybe for next time, because I think this book is already these files were due in late December, so I'm pretty sure if the book hasn't been printed yet, the editors at the very least would be unhappy if I suggested any changes, so we'll just leave it for next time. One thing you'll notice here too is that it says in my appearance panel my stroke is a calligraphic brush. I wanted things, again, to look kind of wobbly, kind of hand-drawn. And what I did is I just applied a little brush in Illustrator. So if I take that away, let's pick one of these paths and just go to my brushes panel rather. And this is way down here because some of my windows are going to pop up in weird places because my screen was much larger until earlier today. Take this back to basic. You can see this is a simple, straight, flat stroke. It's 3/4 of a point in weight all across. But what I can do is I can apply a brush to it. And so let's create a new brush. I'm going to create a calligraphic brush. And what I'm going to do is I can choose to brush it basically with this oval shape that I'm just creating quickly by changing its roundness and its angle and its size. And if I apply that here, now it's imagining what if I took that oval and dragged it across this path. Well, depending on the angle of the path, sometimes I'm going to pick up more width than others. And if I want, I can even edit this brush and I could say, let's change this angle randomly. Let's make it vary. And I'm not sure, how much it ends up varying, how often it wobbles that number around. It's just asking me, do I want to apply this to everything that currently uses it or leave them as is? We'll apply that. You can see it kind of change the wobble a little bit. So by doing that, I get kind of a little bit more of a hand-drawn look. It does sometimes end up with weird situations like this where I've got two different strokes coming together, so there's a quick change in width because of the randomness applied to each one. So I'd need to kind of be a little bit more clean in my topology and say, let's take all these things and join them together. Well, that's pretty close. That's good enough for demonstration purposes, and I can go to Object Path Join, and now they're all one, and it definitely got wrong the order in which I wanted them to join. Sometimes you kind of got to do it one at a time, unfortunately. Well, these might be compound paths, right? This is why I'm doing it live, because sometimes things go wrong and weird. I don't know why it's not joining those in the correct direction. Sometimes, maybe that's why I didn't do it before. I don't know. But it is something you need to keep an eye on. So once I got my strokes in for my provinces in this new improved color, what do we got next on top of that? I have boundaries for my admin 0, my countries. That's next. And those follow pretty much the same principle, except they're white. So they've got calligraphic brushes on them, and they're designed to use negative space. Really big fan of using negative space. That's what I wish I had done on the province strokes, and what I'm doing here for the country strokes. Separate from the fills is dropping these sort of white brushes on top. And the reason that they're separate, you might think, well, couldn't I just take each of these polygons and give them a fill and a stroke? And I can do that with whatever I want here, right? I can like to put things in color just to pop them out for demonstration purposes. And give things a fill and a stroke, and that's fine, but what if this bottom side here is the coastline? I don't necessarily want a stroke on the coast. So what I have is the actual, just the country boundary line features from not from Natural Earth. That's what I would use if I were using Natural Earth, but Project Linework also, for our polygons, we ship those as well. So if I actually turn off the other stuff for a second and just go in outline mode, you can see just the country boundaries. And even if I didn't have those, you can make those pretty easily using the Pathfinder tool. So let me just make a couple of shapes here for a second. I'm just going to have this square, and I'm going to click and drag with Alt, and I'm going to line these up here using the smart guides, and we're going to Alt down to make one more and one more. So what if I just wanted the boundary between these four shapes? Right, so I'm just going to put all these in one layer, because when I copied them, for some reason they didn't all go in the same layer. So I select them all, and I'm going to go to the Pathfinder tools here. And I believe it is Outline is the one that I want. And everything went away, which may promote panic for a moment. But if I look inside my Layers panel, I've got a group, and it's a group of strokes with 0 point. It always gives them a stroke, but 0 points. So I'm just going to make that thick. And I'm going to break my group here. We're going to see what we have. It turns out I have 1 stroke, 2 stroke, 3, 4, so on. I can just now selectively delete pieces. And I can, for example, delete these outside bits. Now, it looks like the topology was slightly off. It didn't view this as an overlap. You got to get your topology right. But in general, I've used this a lot too. If I don't have the boundary features, I can quickly just make it into an outline, and overlaps are removed. There's only one line here, even though there used to be 2 things overlapping. And then I can manually delete the outer edge if I want. So that's a handy one to keep in mind. So let's see what else. Point of interest dots. Yeah, I've got a few dots for various cities that people visited. If I skip ahead quick to the final map, right, these are various places I'm going to label where Max washed dishes in Chengdu, and this is where Shanghai is, etc. So I wanted these dots to look kind of wobbly. I didn't want them to look like perfect circles. In most cases, there are a couple that are, but again, it would seem kind of out of character with the hand-drawn line work. So I made wobbly dots, and if you look very carefully at the highlight, that looks like a circle, especially if I go to outline mode. Right, there's a circle there. And what I have applied here is the roughen modifier. If I turn that off for a second, it goes back to being an ordinary circle. So roughen is applied, effect, distort, roughen. And I'm just going to go to the one I already have in the appearance panel and modify it instead, and you can see what it looks like. I've told it that I want to add every 30 times per inch. I would like you to add details of up to 1.5 points displacement. And I can make them smooth, or I can make them corner. Let me turn on previews. They can get a little sharper. I like to keep them nice and smooth. And I can make them bigger. I can say, let's make those 3-point distortions. That's probably a little too big for what I wanted. I want these to look a little bit more like just quickly sketched in dots. I could make them less frequent. With a small path like this, it's trying to divide its width into a certain number of pieces, so it's probably not going to change too much. If I do 60, though, you see more. I will point out, if you do the roughen tool, the default settings are not quite set up for this usually. It's often set to relative percentage of sort of the path's stroke or the path's width or something like that. And with corners, I usually prefer absolute because I know exactly how far the path is being displaced, and smooth. So you might need to play around with the settings a little bit, but it's kind of cool. So I made some dots, and to make them look a little different from each other, I just did things like, let's take this, I'm just going to drag a copy by holding Alt, and say, let's rotate it. So now it looks like a different one. Stuff like that. Or in a couple of cases, I changed the number of details or the offset of the detail. They're not all quite different from each other, but there's probably 4 or 5 different ones, and I figured that's enough. People aren't going to go around counting them. They're probably not even going to notice. And these small details work best when people don't even notice that you kind of spent your time giving brush strokes to this or that. But they'd know if it were side by side with one that didn't do that. Next up are mountains. There's specifically the Tian Shan Mountains were important to the story, so Frank Langfitt wanted these on there, and we decided to kind of skip the rest of the train, keep it simple. So while there are certainly plenty of other mountains in this area that we're looking at, it's only here that we see them. And I just went in with the pencil tool real quick and drew a few shapes. And I just said, let's go over here and go like that. That's a mountain. And we trim that up a little bit and say, let's delete that section and give it a brush stroke and round it off a little bit, and you're all set. I did probably 3 or 4 different ones. They're not all unique. I see Joanna's comment that this is going partial Huffman for not doing unique dots every time. There seems to be a meme going around, at least some groups of my colleagues, of using my name to indicate excessive detail. Yeah, that's probably the best way to describe it. Excessive obsession with detail, and I do often do that. But in this case, I was in a time crunch, and maybe next time I'll do separate mountains and separate dots every time, just for anybody who happens to notice these things. The mountains, I think, kind of look a little cartoonish in this case. I'm not super satisfied with them, but I've kind of gotten past it. It was time to move on after a few minutes of this. We're on a tight timeline and a tight budget for some of these things, so it was. I still think it looks all right. Finally, the last thing in the base map is this dotted line. There is a particular journey that a couple of people took between 2 different places. Just needed to mark that, and so I put that on the same level of visual hierarchy as everything, as sort of our major features, like our dots. Those are all in black. Those are the main things we need to pay attention to. Those are the things that pop. So I've got, actually, I have 2 dotted lines in here. So I haven't looked at this file in a while, so I have that one, and I have this one. And that actually, as I recall, yeah, that goes for this, the Diaoyu or Senakaku Islands, which are way too tiny to really properly show up, and it would look weird to exaggerate them that much, so we mostly just circled where you'd find them on a map that might have been much larger scale. Dotted lines, I feel like have a little bit of a kind of casual kind of appearance to them. I'm not sure why that is, but it somehow feels less formal to me than drawing these things as solid lines. So that's why I went that way. Nothing particularly groundbreaking about that decision. And then finally, the last thing on top is I've got my clipping path, which clips everything below it. If I turn that off for a second, you can see all of my artwork then bleeds off the artboard. I am a fan of using just one clipping path on a layer and then having it clip everything underneath it. And this is something that really confuses a lot of people, clipping masks. There are 2 ways to make them in Illustrator. There's the terrible way and the right way. So if I said, well, I want to clip all this stuff, the old way that kind of ruins everything, I'm just going to turn this mask off for a second to show you. Select all the stuff that you have, and object clipping mask, make. That's it. And then everything gets clipped, which is great, but now I just have one group with everything in it. There's no layers or sub-layers anymore, and that's a real pain. I've ruined all my organization. So I'm going to undo that. Never do that form. There's a much better way to do it, which is simply to go to your layers panel. There's a button here that says make or release clipping mask. And if I highlight the layer name, gotta highlight the layer name first, and I have some object in the layer, the very first thing in the layer, that will become the mask that clips everything else. If I hit this button, that rectangle now clips everything. And they could clip objects. I don't have to have sublayers inside, but it also happens to clip sublayers as well. I see there's a request to keep this up as a video. That is my hope. Hopefully, if everything goes correctly, YouTube is recording this right now, and as long as nothing terrible happens during this stream, then I will be able to go back and make sure that it all looks good and put it up on my channel so that anybody who missed the beginning or just wants to go back over any of these tools or details can get there. So yeah, hopefully it'll be there, especially because there's people who tweeted at me saying that they were going to miss it because of meetings or work or life responsibilities, things like that. And so hopefully they'll be able to see it too. And again, thank you everybody for taking the time out of your day to do this live, when in fact there probably will be a video of this and you could do this more at a convenient time for yourselves. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the chat going on too and the interaction. This is great. So that's my main map. On top of it, I've got an inset map. He needed to show the Spratly Islands and the 9- line. I'm going to turn on my inset frame too, just so you can see where that is. This is just another map dropped on top of my map. So if I break this thing down, it has a rectangle of its own that's also a clipping mask. And it's got pretty much the same thing going on. It's got another countries layer. This one is less detailed, if you notice, than... let's find an area and overlap. So you see the Philippines right here. I'm going to turn off my highlight. I've got really big highlight paths because I wanted to make sure that it showed up well in the stream. So, but if I look at the Philippines right here, look here, they're much more detailed. This isn't just that I shrank them down. I actually used the other version of Moriarty Hand. I asked Dylan to draw the whole world twice. So that was very kind of him to take the time to do that, and it came in handy in a place like this where I need to make a smaller scale map. So on top of that, got again some simple lines. In this case, I don't know if I actually applied a calligraphic brush to them. Yeah, I didn't. There's nothing here, just because they're so thin that that was probably going to become too noisy, so I didn't want to get in the way. And then I've got the 9- line, which is China's claimed boundary, which they're attempting to promote by building various artificial islands in the sea there. And then a quick label and an ellipse for the Spratly Islands. Again, way too tiny to show up without looking pretty ridiculous at this scale, so just decided to skip showing an exaggerated version. I mean, sometimes I do exaggerate things in maps. That's perfectly legitimate. I'll take an island or something like that and really just blow it up to make sure that you can tell it's there. And I have an ongoing project with the client right now where we've decided that makes sense to do. But in the case of this one, especially with the level of detail that the story needs, mostly just somebody needs to know that the Spratly Islands are there and that they are islands. So this is good enough. On top of that, I've got my inset frame, which is just a line to separate the two of them. And it is just one path, even though it has a black and a white component to it. So if I look at my appearance, what I've done is I've just applied 2 different strokes to this path. I have a 5-point black stroke, and on top of it, a 3-point white stroke. So that, the boundary, that's 2 points difference between them, so 1 point per side. This is a little bit nicer than doing 2 strokes because this is all live, it's all one path, so everything changes if I needed to change it. I am a big fan of making heavy use of the appearance panel. I like to add second strokes or extra fills or various effects to things. So if you haven't used it before, definitely check it out. There's an article I published not that long ago in Cartographic Perspectives called The Power of Appearances. So if you Google that, if you look for Power of Appearances, or if you just go to go back to my website actually, and you go to back home, go to my tutorials. I've got some stuff. Yeah, the power of appearances. The one I published is a slightly more detailed version, but basically talking about what cool stuff you can do with the appearance panel. Like this thing here, this is all one path. This annual plus winter range polygon. So if you just layer things carefully and really sort of leverage what Illustrator can do, you can get a lot done. The appearance panel is basically what I think is the heart of the program. And this is a very simple example of it, just to make this input frame. So Alethea is asking, will I post the AI file? That's an interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. I don't see why not. So yeah, I'll figure out some place to put it. Probably just put it on my WordPress space to share files with, and put a link, or maybe my Dropbox or something. So yeah, I'll put that in the eventual comments of this video, so that you, future reader, future listener who happens to stumble upon this, should be able to get to this. All right, and then finally, there's the type. I always like to put my type in one layer on top of everything else. It's not clipped, it's not in the main map, doesn't need to be, it's all going to fit within my frame. And I've got various sub-layers for all of my different type styles. This was something that was emphasized to me when I took my introductory cartography class. My TA on day one, Dan Reynolds, sort of emphasized the importance of organizing things this way, and I kind of went with it. First thing I will point out is that China is very off-center, as is Mongolia, those two labels. And that's because this book, this map is going to span 2 pages in the book. There's going to be a gutter between them. So if I just real quick draw a line, you can kind of see where that's going to be. I'm going to take this line and align to artboard here, center that. So this is the dividing line between the 2 pages. So there's not really, I could have potentially tracked Mongolia out and really spread it. Said, let's make this, something like that. But while that looks all right now, this book is going to be split, this map is going to be split in the book. So to give you an example of that, I'm just going to take a real, didn't mean to dock that. Actually, I don't need you any more brushes. Got to make good use of my screen space when it's so small. I'm just going to do a quick screenshot here and kind of show in Photoshop kind of how they're going to do this. So if I take my canvas size and widen this some, I don't know, we'll call it 2000. So what's really going to happen is I'm going to take this, and it's going to be split like that. So I thought maybe running the label across the pages might be a little bit, might look a little bit weird. But it also does, the fact they're splitting pages does give me a little bit of flexibility. If you've worked on print layouts before, oftentimes the gutter, it has a width to it. It's with that fold where the pages are sewn together in the middle. So you often can't let things get too close to it. And sometimes you run a map across the gutter and you just have to say, well, I need to keep my labels an inch away from where that fold is going to be, where the page is curving down. In this case, they're putting a split in so that at least all of that gutter space is taken up by nothing, and I can get the labels pretty close to the line if I want to. So I've kept Mongolia kind of just off to the side. It's not ideal, but sometimes you're forced to do these things by circumstances. And China, the label doesn't look too off-center because there's just so much going on in the right side of the page. So the left one looks kind of empty, so it's a good place to actually put it. The typeface I've used here is called Comic Crazy. So I've got labeled here in my character panel. And it's came from this website here, comicbookfonts.com. And I hadn't gotten to use it. I bought it a few years ago. If I just look for it a second, you'll see it costs almost $400. Now, I have good news about this because that's a huge amount of money to pay for a typeface, and I definitely did not pay that much. I almost started like saying like that's a crazy amount to pay, but it's not. If you think about it, artwork deserves to be paid, right? Artists deserve to be paid, and it can take a long time to put together a good typeface. Months sometimes type designers work on these kind of things. Uh, it so happened that a couple of years ago, my brother told me about this site, and he mentioned that they have a sale every New Year's Day, and all of their typefaces go on sale based on the year. So in 2018, January 1st, everything went on sale for $20.18. So that's when I chose to buy this. So put a note in your calendar if you want to buy any cool hand-lettered typefaces. Definitely check back here in January 1st, 2020, assuming they're still running that promotion. I bought a couple of things from them, and this one, I had been sitting on it. I knew that someday I would want this kind of typeface, and it's one of their most popular ones, and it's pretty flexible. So I was glad to get a chance to make use of it. And I thought about hand lettering this map, and I just figured that the time that it would take to do that would be pretty extensive, because I would need to my handwriting is probably not consistent enough to make things look clean, and that's really the nice thing about a comic typeface, is that these things split the difference. They look hand lettered, but they also have a consistency and a clarity to them that puts them kind of halfway in between your handwriting, or at least mine, and a sort of a more rigorous, standard, geometrically constructed typeface. So yeah, that's why I went with something like this. And this is an expensive one too, but it turns out it has a lot of glyphs to it. One of the things that I always need to pay attention to when typing, when putting type on a map, is what kind of options do I have? If I go into the glyphs panel here, I can see it doesn't just have upper and lowercase characters. It has a lot of different stuff. It has all kinds of diacritics. So depending on where I'm labeling somewhere in the world, that could be pretty important to have. And it looks like it's got some Greek, and it's got a euro symbol. It's got Cyrillic too. So the more expensive typefaces tend to have this kind of flexibility, which is important. And so you can get little fun sparkline things. Yeah, so you can. I could hold on. I got to do one of those now. I'm gonna type that. There we go. Oh, I should have done that. If I'd known those glyphs existed, maybe I would have tried seeing how he felt about putting that on the map. That's fun. So, I'm always concerned about the flexibility of my type and making sure I use something that has a lot of options. And this, this comes in two different weights, as well as an oblique, you call it an italic, etc. So it gives me some flexibility, because I need to develop a good type hierarchy where you can clearly tell cities from, various regions and provinces, etc. And part of that's in the color and the size, but part of that is in the type style that we use. So, here, the annotation for what's going on in every individual location, Charles made Mr. Coffee machines here. And then the name of the city is separately in italic, just to help distinguish those further. So as far as type goes, I've got cities, I've got a couple of less important places, Beijing, Urumqi, and they're lighter. They're background information, just because you've probably heard of Beijing. So here's where it is, reader, so that you know where these places are in conjunction with them. A few different physical features, Xinjiang in Tibet, and then the province names, which again, maybe likewise, if I were, using the negative space for the lines, maybe I should have put these at 40. Let's see how that looks. Yeah. Should have followed my own advice about negative space. I often tell people to try and do that, but would have been worth trying this time too. And again, maybe this is 10-point type. That would probably be fine in printing. Probably hold up well enough under press. And that's the thing. I'm never going to see a proof of this map. So it's kind of a guess. How is it going to be printed? What quality? What will hold up? And I don't get a chance to look over it and say, well, that was too thin, or that was too light or dark, and fix it later on. So I'm also playing it kind of conservative, and sometimes using negative space tends to be a little bit more difficult, especially using, if you're going to use white lines or white type, it's got to be got to be big enough, got to be thick enough to stand up. And I've got my admin 0 labels. Sometimes, not really happy with the Vietnam label. Vietnam is a very thin feature at this scale, but so it kind of sticks up past it, unfortunately. Thailand, I couldn't actually, the gutter is right to the right of that, so I couldn't actually put it down here where there was more space. I had to kind of cram it in there. And everything is kind of labeled straight, which is unusual for me. I like to do a lot of curved labels like I did with Xinjiang, but in this case, it seemed, I don't know, it just seemed to fit the aesthetic a little bit more to keep things labeled straight for at least the countries, and that kind of separates them from the more attention-drawing provinces and regions and things like that. And I labeled Russia twice, just both sides of the gutter, and even if there hadn't been a gutter there, I mean, the other option is to make it really giant, right? I could do something like that or really spreading it out. All right, and that's going to look a little off, so twice seemed to make sense in this context. I've had a habit before of really over-tracking my labels sometimes. My TA, when I was a student, yeah, like that. When I was a student, took my intro cartography class, my TA would dock me for that, spreading out Russia to the point where it doesn't even look like one word anymore. And he called it Huffmanizing your labels, is to way overdo that. So I'm glad to be memed now for something, going full Huffman, meaning attention to detail rather than making labels that are confusing to read. I feel like I've progressed. And then finally I've got my labels for the 9- line, which just stuck over the inset there so we know what it is. And then China. And I did stick them in the root of the type layer rather than on sublayer, which is a little odd for me. Normally not that careless. I mean, those are two separate things. They each deserve their own sublayer. But again, trying to loosen up just a little bit. And yeah, that's the map that I made. I'm pretty pleased with how it came out, and I love working in monochrome, as many of you know. So it's always a great chance to work within those challenges and constraints. I always have a lot of fun doing it. So I guess with that, I wonder if you guys have any specific questions that you haven't asked up to this point. And there's a time delay here, so I'm just going to be quiet for a minute and wait for you to catch up and say something. Where is this map being published? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't actually know the book title either. So that's something I should probably find out. And, I should ask him if it's been published, and maybe I'll leave those details. I should put them on my portfolio as well, where this map is featured. I try and do that for authors when when it's going to be in a book later on. I check in with them, find out when it is, and if the book has a website. So I'll see if I can find some details later on. How long did it take me? Andrew asks. That's a good question. So let me look over my let's get my files here. I can tell, based on dates of files, I started on November 22nd and I ended on December 7th. That's not hours-wise how long it took me, but that was, on and off over a little while because I'd send him drafts and he'd get back to me, or the publisher would get back to me with some of these things. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm really bad at knowing in advance how long something will take me and remembering afterwards. So not hundreds of hours, certainly, and not just a couple hours. Definitely somewhere in between those numbers. Probably a 2-digit number of hours. Probably a 2-digit number that starts with 1. Something like that. Any other questions before I let you all get back to your lives? And while you're pondering that, I will show you one last thing real quick. If you notice in here, there is another map of Shanghai. I made a second map for the book, just about some particular places that different people lived and that were important to the story. So just pulled some data from OpenStreetMap to get a few roads and kind of worked with him about what were the critical roads, and then dropped a few various points of interest on there. One weird thing that about working with large scale mapping in China is that lat long coordinates tend to have some significant errors because China introduces semi-random offsets into its datum. So just be aware of that. If you try and plot something in China, it doesn't always end up in the right place. So you might need to do some, if you do some ground truthing or look at some imagery that's been corrected. Fun fact. Joanna asks, what was the hardest part? I think just, oftentimes, almost any of these maps, the hardest part is just trying to make everything fit entirely in this one monochrome color ramp and have it be legible. Because every time I drop something on there, I say, okay, I'm going to, put provinces on there. Well, that means it's got to probably be darker than China. And China's got to be darker than everything else around it, which means I'm really cutting into how much I have left to do for the labels or the points of interest. So there's a lot of constant back and forth, trying new things like, what if I made this lighter? Well, if I go 50, is that too light? Will that distinction still hold up on press? And if I go down to 20, I could try lighter than China, but does that look too much like the countries? So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of back and forth to just find something that works. And there's a limit. Right? Just like any map, there's a limit to how much you can fit legibly in one space. So yeah, there's choosing the colors, as it were, colors in quotation marks, is the toughest. Lethe asks what I consider the smallest type size for print. I think for me it's going to depend on the typeface. With something like this, it's got a little bit more character to it. What's the smallest I have on here? Probably the Hangzhou. Yeah, that's 8 points. Looks like. I've got my highlights turned off so you can't see. Yep, yeah, 8 points. For something like this, that's probably safest for, especially just to make sure if the print quality is really low that we're going to be fine. If we have a decent print quality though, and I have a little bit more of a quote-unquote normal typeface, so that's really tracked out there. Let's go back to where we were, and I don't know, pick something like Avenir. Geometric Sans tends to hold up pretty light. 6 point is probably fine for a lot of things, but do test prints, check that. Definitely important to do, important to check. And the darker the type, certainly it's going to hold up more. White is just a hole in the print, so that's going to be a little bit harder. It's not defined by ink, it's defined by the absence of ink, so usually that needs to be a little bit thicker and a little bit bigger. All right, so before we leave off, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me. This is way more people than I anticipated. I think it said at one point there were like 40 of you, which is crazy. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend with me and ask questions and talk about your experiences. And if you're watching this video in the future, thank you for watching the video. First off, once again, give the plug for my website, somethingaboutmaps.com. You can visit my portfolio there, or check out tutorials, or reach me on Twitter, or email me if you got questions or something like that. Find out who I am, or go over to my Patreon if you want to throw some support my way to keep doing these kind of things. I am thinking about, this is an experiment, but I'm thinking about doing more of these. The general idea is to live stream. The specifics about what I would do in a live stream, that may vary some. I'm not totally sure. I've got some other ideas that I bounced around with people, like, maybe I could, I've done things where I make maps live in front of people. There's a limit to kind of how far you can get without spending a lot of time, but it can be useful to watch somebody work from the ground up. I have also thought about maybe doing interviews, so something pretty much just suited to an audio format. But I think it'd be kind of fun to sit down with some of you, some of my colleagues, and pick your brains about things you've worked on, or your careers, etc. So if you've got some ideas, you can tweet them at me, things you want to see in the future. And otherwise, I'll catch you all next time. Thanks so much for joining me, and have a good day.